Hi, friends. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. If you're new here, and this is the space where we dive deep into some of the darkest and most haunting true crime stories from around the world. These aren't just tales of violence, they're stories about people, about families, about the circumstances that can twist ordinary lives into tragedies we can hardly comprehend. I believe it's important not only to tell what happened, but also to reflect on why it happened and what it says about us as human beings. So settle in with me. Today's case is one that shocked an entire nation, not just for the brutality of the crime itself, but for the disturbing truths it revealed about class power and the hidden lives of two sisters whose bond would eventually turn deadly. Chapter 1: The Night Everything Changed. Hi, friends, how are you today? I hope you're doing well. I know life can get heavy sometimes, and that's partly why I sit down to share these stories with you. Because they're not just crime stories, they're windows into human nature, into the darker sides of relationships and society. Now, before I jump into today's case, let me set the scene for you. Imagine this: it's France, the early 1930s, a time of glitz and glamour, for some when the wealthy would gather at extravagant parties, drink champagne, and dance until dawn. It looked beautiful from the outside, but as we know all too well, appearances can be deceiving. On February 2nd, 1933, a respected man named René Lancelin was supposed to attend one of these gatherings with his wife and daughter. They had a comfortable life in Le Mans, a provincial city in France, and nothing about them suggested that tragedy was about to strike. René went about his day handling his business, then later made his way to the party expecting to meet his family there. But when he arrived, he couldn't find them. At first he thought maybe they were running late or perhaps he had missed them in the crowd. He mingled, he asked around, but nobody had seen his wife or daughter. As the evening dragged on, his uneasiness grew. Something didn't feel right. Eventually he decided to go back home, thinking maybe they had returned early. When René opened the door, the sight that greeted him was nothing short of horrific. Lying at the foot of the staircase were the lifeless bodies of his wife Léonie and his daughter Geneviève. Blood pooled beneath them, dark and heavy, and the brutality of what had been done was unlike anything he could have imagined. Their eyes had been gouged out, torn violently from their sockets. It was a scene that shook the entire city, and it didn't take long for whispers to spread, asking the same questions we're asking now. Who could have committed such an act, and why this wasn't some faceless intruder or a random break-in? No, the truth was far more disturbing, because the answer would lead investigators straight into the private lives of two sisters who had spent years living under that very roof. And their story, how they came to be there, what they endured, and how it all spiraled into violence, is one of the most infamous true crime cases in French history. And that's where we begin. Chapter 2: Behind the Doors of the Lancelin Home. To understand how this crime came to be, we need to step back and look at the world these people lived in. France in the early 1930s was a place of contrasts. On one side, you had the glitter of high society, lavish dinners, endless parties, and families who seemed untouchable in their wealth and reputation. On the other, you had the working-class men and women who spent their entire lives serving the needs of others, often invisible, often voiceless. The Lancelin family stood firmly on the privileged side. René had been a lawyer successful enough to retire early. He and his wife Léonie were well respected in Le Mans. They had money status and a beautiful home in the center of town. Their daughter Geneviève, young and admired, seemed to embody the family's polished image. They were seen as the kind of family others might envy, a portrait of comfort and stability. But appearances are tricky. Behind closed doors, relationships aren't always what they seem, and the servants who lived within those same walls often saw a very different side of things. For years, two sisters, Christine and Léa Papin, worked inside the Lancelin home. They cooked, they cleaned, they managed the daily rhythms of the household, often for 12 to 14 hours a day. Week after week, year after year, they carried out the quiet, thankless work that kept the family's lifestyle intact. Think about that for a moment. Imagine living in a house where you could never fully call a single corner your own, where you worked until exhaustion ate whatever scraps you were given, and lived entirely at the mercy of the people you served. For Christine and Léa, this wasn't just a job. This was their entire existence. And while Renee seemed distant, almost uninvolved, Léonie was known for her exacting standards. Some called her harsh, others even cruel. She was the kind of woman who would run her fingers along a freshly polished surface, searching for even the faintest trace of dust, ready to lash out if she found it. To her, perfection wasn't a request, it was a demand. And if those demands weren't met, punishment followed. It's important to understand this dynamic because the seeds of resentment, isolation, and desperation don't just appear out of nowhere. They build slowly, silently in the small moments of humiliation and fear. By the time February of 1933 arrived, those seeds had already taken root inside the Papin sisters. And that's what makes this case so haunting. It wasn't a sudden burst of madness from strangers. It was something that had been festering inside a home that looked from the outside like the very picture of order and respectability. Chapter 3. The Papin sisters' broken beginnings. Christine and Léa Papin did not come from stability or warmth. Long before their names became tied to one of France's most infamous murders, their story had already been shaped by neglect and cruelty at home. Their mother, Clémence, never truly wanted children. She made sure they knew it. She could be cold, distant, and openly resentful toward her daughters. Their father, Gustave, didn't provide the protection they needed either. He drank heavily, disappearing into alcohol instead of into the lives of his children. Together, their parents created a household that felt less like a family and more like a trap. The sisters were 3 in total, the eldest Amelia, then Christine, and finally Léa, the youngest. Amelia's fate was perhaps the most devastating. At just 10 years old, she was sexually abused by her father. When Clémence found out, you might expect her to defend her daughter. Instead, she turned her rage on Amelia. She accused her child of seducing her own father as though the crime belonged to the victim. And for this imagined sin, Amelia was sent away to a strict orphanage run by nuns cast aside and punished for being harmed. Christine and Léa's paths weren't much better. Clémence didn't want the responsibility of raising them. She placed them in religious institutions and eventually arranged for them to work as live-in maids for wealthier families. Whatever wages they earned didn't belong to them. It went straight back into their mother's pockets. So from an early age, both girls were taught that love was conditional, that home was not a safe place, and that their worth lay in obedience and silence. Instead of learning what it meant to be cherished, they learned how to clean, how to serve, and how to endure. But when you strip away someone's sense of belonging, their need for connection doesn't disappear, it grows sharper, more desperate. Christine and Léa clung to each other. They became one another's only source of comfort, the only constant in lives that otherwise felt disposable. Over time, this dependence grew into something more intense, more complicated, and eventually crossed boundaries that would shock even the most hardened investigators. Looking back, it isn't difficult to trace the cracks that were already forming. A father who betrayed them, a mother who discarded them, a childhood filled with labor instead of love. These were the building blocks of their lives. None of this excused what they would later do, but it does reveal how the seeds of violence were planted. By the time Christine and Léa walked through the doors of the Lancelin household, they were already carrying a lifetime of wounds. All it would take was pressure, relentless grinding pressure for those wounds to split open and spill into the tragedy that was yet to come. Chapter 4. Behind Closed Doors, in the Lancelin household. When Christine and Léa entered the Lancelin home, it might have seemed at first like a stroke of luck. For 2 young women who had grown up unwanted, mistreated, and abandoned, finding steady work with a wealthy, respected family must have felt like security. In many ways it was. They were given warm meals, a room to share, and clothing to wear to church on Sundays. Compared to the strict orphanages and harsh employers they had known before the Lancelin house, seemed like an improvement. But the reality was far from easy. Their days stretched endlessly, 12, sometimes 14 hours of cooking, scrubbing, ironing, and polishing every corner of the grand home. 7 days a week, year after year. The only real break they had was mandatory church attendance, which hardly counted as rest. And then there was Madame Lancelin Léonie. She was known for her sharp eyes and sharper temper. She held impossibly high standards of cleanliness. People whispered about her infamous white glove tests where she would run her finger along a surface, and if she found even the faintest trace of dust, punishment followed. Sometimes it was harsh words, sometimes worse. For Christine and Léa, it meant constant fear of failure, constant tension in a house that was never truly theirs. Imagine living under those conditions, already burdened by years of trauma and now forced to endure a new kind of suffocation. The Lancelin home looked respectable from the outside, but inside it was a place where pressure simmered quietly, where resentment had time to take root. Through it all, the sisters had only each other. They were isolated from the outside world, discouraged from making friends or building lives of their own. Their bond, which had always been strong, grew even closer. But in that closeness, something darker began to develop. It wasn't just sisterly loyalty anymore. It was dependence, emotional, physical, even romantic. Investigators later discovered that Christine and Léa's relationship had crossed into incest, a revelation that scandalized the public when it came to light. And while it's unsettling to hear in some ways, it reflects just how deeply their world had narrowed. They had no parents, no friends, no real freedom. In their isolation, they turned entirely toward one another, blurring every boundary until they could no longer separate themselves as individuals. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Christine and Léa had been with the Lancelins for more than 7 years. They had spent nearly a decade in silence, working without complaint, following every order. They were so quiet that Monsieur Lancelin later admitted he had never once spoken directly to them. It was as if they existed in the shadows of the household, invisible, voiceless. But shadows can only hold so much before they collapse into darkness. And for Christine and Léa, the years of silence, pressure, and isolation were building toward something catastrophic. The night of February 2nd, 1933, would prove to be the breaking point. Chapter 5. The night of February 2nd, 1933. That cold February evening began like any other day in the Lancelin household. Christine and Léa had their usual endless list of chores. Cooking, scrubbing, folding, tasks that never seemed to end. On that day, though, a small accident set everything in motion. The iron had stopped working. It needed to be repaired, so Léa was sent to the shop to have it fixed. When she brought it back and plugged it in, the house went dark. A fuse had blown, and suddenly the entire home was without power. For the sisters, this was more than a minor inconvenience. They knew Madame Lancelin's temper, how furious she became when anything was out of order. With the house dark, the ironing undone, and chores still unfinished, panic began to rise. Christine and Léa decided to keep working through the daylight, hoping to fix the fuse, later praying that no one would notice. But Madame Léonie and her daughter Geneviève returned home much earlier than expected. They walked into a house without power clothes, still unpressed tasks incomplete. To them, it must have looked like neglect. To the sisters, it must have felt like a trap snapping shut. Léonie was livid. Words turned into accusations and then into physical violence. According to later testimony, she struck Christine first. Years of fear and silence erupted in that instant. Christine, desperate and cornered, grabbed the nearest object she could reach, a heavy pewter pitcher, and swung. The blow landed. Geneviève, horrified, rushed in to help her mother, and suddenly the room was chaos. Léa, hearing the commotion from the kitchen, ran in to find her sister on the floor, struggling against the two women. And then something inside her snapped. Christine shouted orders, frenzied, telling her to fight back. Together they turned on Madame Léonie and Geneviève, with a kind of fury that had been building for years. What happened next was almost unimaginable. The sisters gouged out their victims' eyes with their bare hands. The violence didn't stop there. They found a hammer and a knife and used them to bludgeon and mutilate the women. The attack lasted nearly 2 hours. By the time it ended, Léonie and Geneviève lay lifeless at the foot of the stairs, unrecognizable, their bodies broken beyond comprehension. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a quick act of rage. This was sustained, prolonged brutality. It was as though all the resentment, All the humiliation, all the years of silent suffering had exploded in one catastrophic act. When the house finally grew quiet again, Christine and Léa didn't flee. They didn't even try to cover their tracks. Instead, they retreated to their bedroom, locked the door, and lay down together, clinging to each other in the aftermath of what they had done. By the time Monsieur Lancelin returned home later that evening, the house stood dark and silent, and what he would discover inside would haunt not only him, but the entire city of Le Mans. Chapter 6. The Discovery. When Monsieur Lancelin first returned home that evening, he found the house completely dark. At first he wasn't alarmed. Maybe his wife and daughter had already gone on to the dinner party, he thought. The locked front door only seemed to confirm that. He turned away convinced he'd simply meet them later at the gathering. But when he arrived at the party and still found no trace of them, that uneasy feeling crept back. He asked around, spoke to friends, but no one had seen Léonie or Geneviève. Hours had passed by now, and the pit in his stomach only grew heavier. Something was wrong. So René returned to the house, this time with police by his side. Together they forced their way inside. The moment the door opened, they were met with a chilling silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, that presses against your ears and makes the hair on your arms rise. At the foot of the staircase lay the bodies of Léonie and Geneviève. The scene was beyond brutal. Their faces were disfigured, their heads battered so violently that they were almost unrecognizable. Pools of blood had spread across the floor, and most disturbing of all, their eyes. One pair had been buried in the folds of a scarf around Léonie's neck. Another pair lay on the stairs nearby. The horror of it was enough to make seasoned officers recoil. It was as though rage itself had torn through the house, leaving behind nothing but ruin. But the police still had a job to do. They began searching the home room by room, calling out, in case anyone else was there. Eventually, they reached the sisters' small bedroom upstairs. Light flickered faintly under the door, and when they tried to open it, they found it locked from the inside. Forcing their way in, they discovered Christine and Léa Papin lying together on the bed. Some accounts say they were naked, holding each other, others that they were simply huddled close, clutching one another like frightened children. On the bedside table sat a hammer caked with blood and hair, the very weapon that had been used in the murders. The sisters did not deny what had happened. They didn't scream, they didn't plead. In fact, they barely resisted at all as the police took them into custody. It was as if they had accepted their fate the moment the violence stopped. Word of the murders spread quickly through Le Mans. Neighbors, friends, the entire community struggled to make sense of the crime. How could two quiet, obedient maids, young women who had served the same family for 7 years, without a single incident, commit such an unspeakable act? The discovery shocked the city, but it was only the beginning. Because once the details reached the newspapers, once the world learned not just of the murders, but of the strange, unsettling relationship between the Papin sisters, the case would spiral into one of the most sensational trials France had ever seen. Chapter 7. A Trial That Divided France. When the news of the murders broke, it spread like wildfire. This wasn't just another crime story, it had all the elements that gripped the public's imagination. 2 young women, quiet maids with no criminal history, who had lived and worked in the same home for years. A wealthy, respected family cut down in their own house. And then, the detail that turned shock into scandal. Christine and Léa's relationship with each other, a bond so intense and so taboo that newspapers hinted at incest. France in 1933 was stunned. How could this happen? How could 2 women who prayed, who attended church, who had never once been in trouble with the law, suddenly erupt into such unimaginable violence? The public wanted answers, and the courtroom became the stage for those answers to unfold. From the start, the sisters didn't deny what they had done. Christine spoke freely to investigators, insisting that the attack had been self-defense, that Madame Léonie had struck her first, and she had reacted out of fear. But the brutality of the crime made that explanation difficult to believe. Pulling out someone's eyes, bludgeoning them for nearly 2 hours, this wasn't a momentary loss of control. This was rage sustained and relentless. In court, Christine did most of the talking. Léa remained quiet, almost silent, as though she had retreated entirely into her sister's shadow. The defense attorneys tried to build their case around the sisters' traumatic childhoods and the possibility of mental illness. They pointed to the history of abuse, the neglect from their mother, the instability of their upbringing. They argued that Christine and Léa were not guilty by reason of insanity, that their actions came from years of untreated trauma and psychological collapse. But psychiatric experts had already examined the sisters, and their conclusion was damning. Both Christine and Léa were legally sane. Troubled, yes. Damaged, certainly, but not insane. This left the jury to decide how to weigh the unbearable cruelty of their crime against the unbearable cruelty of the lives they had endured. And that's where the country split. Some people demanded execution. To them, the Papin sisters were monsters, and monsters deserved the guillotine. Others saw them as victims themselves, crushed under a system that treated servants as less than human women, as disposable, and children as property. To that group, Christine and Léa were tragic figures, products of a society that had abandoned them long before the killings ever took place. The trial became more than just a question of guilt. It became a reflection of France itself, of class and power of privilege and exploitation. And in the end, the verdict came down hard. Christine, seen as the ringleader, was sentenced to death by guillotine. Léa, considered weaker, more of a follower, received 10 years of hard labor. The court may have passed judgment, but the public debate didn't end there. To this day, the Papin case is remembered not just for the violence, but for the questions it forced people to confront about inequality, oppression, and the breaking points of the human mind. Chapter 8: Aftermath and Haunting Legacy. The sentences were handed down in 1933, but the story of the Papin sisters didn't end with the verdict. In many ways, that was only the beginning of the darker, quieter tragedy that followed. Christine declared the mastermind waited in prison for her execution. But what the public didn't see was how quickly her mind began to unravel. Separated from Léa for the first time in nearly a decade, she spiraled. She begged for her sister, constantly screaming during the night, tearing at her clothes, even attempting to gouge out her own eyes as if reenacting the horror she had once inflicted. Guards had to place her in a straitjacket just to keep her from harming herself. It became clear that execution was not going to come. In 1934, her death sentence was commuted to hard labor, and soon after she was transferred to an asylum. But the asylum brought no peace. Christine refused to eat, wasting away slowly, as though life itself had become unbearable without Léa by her side. In 1937, at just 32 years old, she died of starvation, a ghost of the violent, desperate figure who had shocked a nation only 4 years earlier. Léa's story played out differently. After serving only 8 years of her sentence, she was released early for good behavior. She changed her name, slipped back into anonymity, and found work once again as a maid, remarkably returning to the very role that had defined so much of her life. Unlike her sister Léa, adjusted to life on the outside, but she never completely escaped the shadow of what had happened. Some reports claim she lived quietly until the early 1980s. Others suggest she survived as long as 2001, passing away from a stroke. And then there was the eldest sister, Amelia, the one who had been cast out as a child after her father's abuse. Her path took her into a convent where she became a nun at the age of 16. A life of silence and devotion, perhaps an attempt to find peace where none had been given to her as a child. Looking back, the story of the Papin sisters is more than just the record of a brutal crime. It is a story about neglect, about a society that failed its most vulnerable, about what happens when isolation and resentment are allowed to fester unchecked. Their legacy lingers because it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Were Christine and Léa simply cold-blooded killers, or were they products of a broken system, women shaped by cruelty, left with no outlet until violence became their final act of expression? Even now, decades later, the case feels both distant and disturbingly close. It reminds us that behind every headline, every sensational story, there are lives that were shaped long before the crime ever took place. Lives that, if given love and dignity, might never have turned so dark. Chapter 9: Closing reflections. And so that is the story of Christine and Léa Papin, two sisters who began life already broken, discarded by their parents, forced into years of servitude, and who ultimately erupted in one of the most shocking crimes France had ever seen. Even now, I find myself wrestling with it. Was this simply an act of pure evil, or was it the inevitable consequence of a lifetime of neglect, humiliation, and isolation? If Christine and Leia had grown up in a different home, with care and stability instead of cruelty, would things have ended differently? Or was there something darker within them that was always destined to come out? Cases like this linger because they don't give us neat answers. They force us to confront how fragile the line can be between control and collapse, between obedience and rebellion, between the quiet suffering we don't see and the explosive violence that no one can ignore. What do you think? Was Christine truly the mastermind pulling her younger sister into her orbit? Or were they both victims of their parents, of their employers, of a system that gave them no escape? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. This is the kind of story that stays with you, not just because of the horror of the crime, but because of the questions it leaves behind. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening and reflecting. Take care of yourselves. Hold close to the people you love, and remember, behind every case we talk about, there are real lives, real pain and lessons we can't afford to forget. Until next time, stay safe and I'll see you soon. That's all for today's story on True Crime Echoes. If this case left you with questions or thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Drop a comment and let me know how you see it. Do you believe the Papin sisters were cold-blooded murderers, or were they victims of a system that failed them from the very start? If you found this video meaningful, consider subscribing so you don't miss future episodes. Sharing these stories helps keep the memory of the past alive and gives us a chance to reflect on the world we live in now. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, hold close to the people you love, and remember, every story we tell here echoes far beyond the crime itself. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.